So we start our session from Professor Robert Faff. Professor Robert, are you ready, please?
Yes, Imran.
You can
Thank you
share
very
your
much.
screen.
Yes, I'll do that right now. Right, so hopefully you can see the opening slide of my presentation.
Yes.
And yep, very good. Okay, it's a great pleasure to kick off this symposium on supervising the supervisors. And the broad title of my topic will be Pitching Responsible Science Matters. So I've got 3 goals to help supervisors. The first is I'm going to explain somewhat by way of background, but I think it turns out to be much more important than background when it's all said and done, the concept of responsible science, at least my view of what this concept is and why it's important. Secondly, I'll move on then to very briefly share with you the pitching research framework that I developed about 7 or 8 years ago, and I've been working hard to spread it worldwide since. I apologise to those of you that have been exposed to this before. I'll just give a flavour of it, and then I will bring the two together and actually make a case for why it's valuable for supervisors to have their students pitch responsible science to them. And then at the very end, and I'll probably run out of time, but I've made these slides available and I've asked Imran to share these amongst you, whoever's interested. There is a number of slides with helpful resources and opportunities, and right through the presentation, there are a number of links in the slides that you will find valuable as supervisors. So let me first go to goal 1. So I'm going to keep emphasizing my goal is to help supervisors, and I'll assume everyone watching are supervisors, although I understand some of you aren't. But I am talking to supervisors and trying to give you some general advice on how I think I can help you make your supervision experience a lot more successful than it otherwise might be. So I want to first of all talk about responsible science. And you might ask, well, what do I mean by science? You might even say, hey, I don't do science. I do finance, or I do accounting, or some other research. Well, for me, we're all scientists. We don't have to be physical scientists. We don't have to be hard scientists. We don't have to be lab scientists. We can very nicely and legitimately be social scientists. And so think of science as essentially, at least the way I view it, as research, as scholarly research. And it links very much to knowledge and knowledge creation. So when I talk of science and producing research, it's a creation of knowledge, and I really have in mind scholarly research. So as supervisors, you will have a very good idea of what I mean by scholarly research. But in order to help you, if you need to, in an early conversation with your students, convey this, let me share with you just one little snippet, and it comes from the Australian setting. The Australian Research Council have given, I believe, a very succinct and helpful view of what research is. And I'm sure you, in your jurisdiction, would have a research body that would also give you a similar statement. So it's about the creation of new knowledge and or the use of existing knowledge in a new and creative way so as to generate new concepts, methodologies, inventions, and understandings. And it includes synthesis and analysis of previous research to the extent that it is new and creative. Now, there's a few things that are being reinforced and repeated here, which I think drive home the message. So newness and novelty is important. in red, there are 4 instances in that very short extract where new is mentioned. Knowledge is there twice, and creation, creative, is there 3 times. So to me, if I'm conveying to a student as a supervisor, I want to drive home the message that doing research is about creating new knowledge. So research, science, what is responsible science? What I would draw your attention to, and there are many sources available, very many legitimate and credible sources for giving us an insight into responsible science. But one I particularly like was put out there in 2017 by the so-called Community for Responsible Research in Business and Management. And at the bottom of this slide, there's a link. When you get these slides, if you're interested, you can click that link and go to their latest information. But they put forward a 2030 vision, which is now only 8 years away. And it's all about responsible science. And in this vision, they emphasize 2 elements: that the research that we do should be useful, and the research that we execute should create credible knowledge. Useful knowledge, credible knowledge. So they are 2 key pillars that I totally agree with, but I would actually add a 3rd pillar, which I guess is implicit in what they're saying, but it deserves to have its own pillar. So credible research, relevant research, independent research. These are the 3 key pillars of what I view as responsible science. So when we think of and we talk to our students, and as supervisors, I believe we should try and impress upon them from a very early stage and regularly that they should aim or strive to create credible research, that is, reliable knowledge. They should, as much as possible, aim, strive to create relevant research, that is, useful knowledge. And thirdly, they should aim and strive to create independent research, and that will give us unbiased knowledge. Now, it is true to say, I believe, that there is a tug of war in many ways in this landscape. And one of them that I draw attention to in this slide is between passion versus objectivity, or at least where passion can challenge objectivity. And I think in the context of responsible science, if as a supervisor, I'm communicating with a student, then I want to make it very clear that passion is good, provided it's focused on the question, on the research question. And I get very worried, I get very nervous, I get very concerned if the passion slips to be all about the outcome, because then, among other things, I'm worried that they won't be independent and that they will let the outcome drive the research. In the end, it won't be research. It will be fake. It will be challenged in terms of having fakeness about it. So passion about the question, be objective about the answer. Now, responsible science matters. And as a supervisor, I really urge you to drive this message home very early with our students, because I have a real concern that the shape of research, the research ecosystem, and where we have evolved to, for many reasons that I just do not have time to talk about here, leaves us in a state of crisis. I believe we are in a state of crisis, and I'll give you a few hints around what I believe that crisis relates to very shortly, but it broadly relates to responsible science. Now, on this slide, I give a few suggestions of what I think are hallmarks of responsible science. I won't go through the list, but it should be good science. It should be a true contest of ideas, and basically it should be reliable. So I've hinted that I think there's a crisis. Now, most of you as supervisors, you may think I'm crazy. There's no crisis. There's nothing to worry about. The way we do research is wonderful. Well, I don't believe so. And let me tell you 3 flavors of why there may be a crisis. Now, time prevents me from going into detail on any of these, but let me just pick off the first one, replication. Replication is important. And I think in our discipline, in our industry, the scholarly research industry, and us as supervisors, we've forgotten this. We've forgotten it to the extent that supervisors will use the replication strategy with their students, but they will downgrade its importance, and we never share. There are really great replications that occur every day, and they are not shared. And this is valuable information for us and our students and as supervisors to guide them about how the world really works. Now, when you combine that with a view that there may be a publication bias, and I could talk about this for a long time, but think of the last time you read a study where there was insignificant results. It is so rare. Do you believe the body of literature that's published that tells you there are no insignificant results? To be honest, I don't. And we have to warn our students that there is a hidden element of very capably done research that never gets published that we should be aware of and we should think about. So what are the solutions? There are no easy solutions. And I'm not going to pretend I have many or any great solutions, but I'm going to give you a flavor of the direction that I think this needs to go. And it's going to require a degree of cultural change and a somewhat parallel cultural change that is embraced over time and naturally. We can't force this, but naturally by key stakeholders in the system. Now, who might be some of the key stakeholders? Well, the deans of our faculties might be key stakeholders. The editors of journals might be key stakeholders, and researchers themselves. Us as supervisors, we are researchers, but we're guiding the new breed of researchers. And they have a key place in this puzzle, but there are many other stakeholders as well. Now, in this slide, I'm suggesting that, well, maybe we could hope for some visionary action by a dean or by an editor or by a researcher. And the problem is, and it's quite perverse, I believe, that if you, as a loner, risk being seen as a visionary, you'll actually be seen as someone that has gone crazy and going against the flow of the system. For example, as an editor, Pacific Basin Finance Journal, I instituted a replication section, replication studies section in the journal beginning of 2019. And that's super risky because we've had it drummed into us since the time that we did our PhDs, the time that we were researchers, that publishing replications is a waste of time. It's a low effort, and why bother? And I recoil against that absolutely. We need to publish replications. We need to understand how reliable research is in our domain. So it serves a very important purpose for that, as well as a training ground for our students. But what have I done? I've risked, and I'm hoping the community will see that this is important for Pacific Basin Finance Journal, but there will be a group of so-called elite researchers that may be saying, Faff's a nut. Why is he publishing replications? And that if that view takes hold, then that could jeopardize the established reputation of the journal. But I think it is so important, that's a risk that I am willing to take. So possible actions by journal editors, publishers, and researchers are to take replications more seriously. For editors to actually state and put out there they will publish replications. Take Evo Welsh at the Critical Finance Review in the finance area. Now, Evo in this sense, I believe, is a trailblazer. Long before 2019, when I decided to go down this path with PBFJ, Evo was welcoming replications for his journal, and he still does. And this is important. We need more journals to do this because it's part of a bigger solution long term. Another part of the solution is inviting or embracing a pre-registration process. I don't have enough time to even scratch at the surface of what this is about, but what it's trying to do is to take off the table the presumption that statistical significance is a necessary condition for getting a paper published. That is absolutely bad. And a pre-registration process, while there's no silver bullets here, and this can be abused like any solution we come up with to improve the system, bad human behavior can find ways around it. But I firmly believe that having a pre-registration process, which gives rise to what you might call an in-principle accept, purely based on a plan of what the research is going to be before you've looked at the data, before you've done the analysis. And what you're trying to do is take off the table the feeling by the researchers they have to find statistically significant results. No, I want you to tell me what you believe are the results that explain how the world works in this field. That is important. That's what I'm after. And we are at Pacific Basin Finance Journal, under my leadership. We're going to head down this path and experiment, I guess, and test this out. I'm on the lookout to pre-register very good, sound plans where there's a good idea, a watertight method showing gold standard design, research design, and gold standard data, and a solid idea. These are the things I want to say. I will publish that as long as you follow a protocol that you've developed prior to executing the study. I also believe in systematic reviews as another arm of this, and this is something that I am embracing at Pacific Basin Finance Journal. This is not so easy to read, but it's just to show you that I made a declaration as editor of Pacific Basin Finance Journal to go down this path of responsible science. You can find that editorial in the Pacific Basin website if you're interested, or if you want me to point you to it offline, I can do that as well. Now, what can university leaders and deans do? Well, I've highlighted the one that I think is relevant to this talk, and that is research training. Hey, we're supervisors of HDR students. Research training is front and center of what we're trying to do, and capacity building. So we are part of that solution as long as those university leaders actually give us the resources and the encouragement to go down that path. Now, what can we do as research scholars? Well, we have to be careful. The system is still the system. And what I would like to encourage is everyone to just start thinking about how it might change and how we might, at the edges, change the way we view doing research. You can't upend everything, otherwise you'll be you'll fail because you're a visionary researcher and everyone thinks you're nuts. But I've highlighted things that I think we should do as researchers, that we should do as supervisors, and that we should start to encourage more with our students. So embrace front-end holistic planning. So force or require a plan of research as detailed as it can be prior to data collection, prior to analysis, prior to execution, and then follow through on that. And this does not mean you can't divert from your plans. What we then need to do is be honest, and when we write up our research, any diversion from plans is put under a different heading. We don't pretend we had the idea all along. We put it under the heading of essentially exploratory or ex post analysis. Now, the totem pole of the hierarchy of research would indicate that that type of research won't be seen quite as strongly as research that we had the idea all along, that we developed the theory, we had models and we had hypotheses before we did the analysis. But there is no shame in this context of being honest and pointing to what is somewhat exploratory. We still can learn from that. We need to be more honest about how we do that. We should encourage as supervisors, we should encourage our students to proactively pitch their research whenever the opportunity arises. And this will lead into goal 2 of my talk. And I would like to encourage researchers generally, supervisors and their students to voluntarily pre-register their research plans so that you have it as a record, public record as to what you plan to do, and it can be matched against what you actually did do. So where can I learn more about this, I hear you say? And I would point you to one of my SSRN papers. It's called Responsible Science Matters. It's easy to find on SSRN, but the link is here. If you get the slides, if you take a photo now, you can have the address. And there's also a video that I have recorded that goes into much more detail about responsible science. So let me now move to goal 2, and I'm going to skip over this pretty quickly. I normally give webinars on this for an hour and a half on pitching research, but I'm going to do it in a nutshell, and then I'm going to point you to where you can find out more. So I am going to start with one of my favorite cartoons, and it is relevant to what this is about. And I almost feel like, and I've talked about this cartoon so many times, but when I look at it, it's like I'm about to reveal a dark secret to you about my supervision, right? So you're supervisors, I'm talking to you about supervision, and now I'm going to reveal a dark secret. And the dark secret is when you are faced with a situation like this simple 3-cell cartoon. Thank you to phdcomics.com for doing a great service to academia by giving us a humorous way of looking at some real issues. And here's a real issue. So there I am. I'm the supervisor. I have had a beard in the past. I'm not so good on hair up on the top of my head. Occasionally I've worn glasses, lovely green vest. That's me. That's the supervisor. And I don't know how many of you might relate to someone like me in this cartoon. There's our student that we're supervising. We only see him in the very first cell, and it's just from behind. And essentially, this is the beginning of a meeting. I like 30-minute meetings. So I can imagine myself beginning of a 30-minute meeting, and the student's actually given me something before the meeting, which is a bonus. It often doesn't happen. But the problem is, as we see in cells 2 and especially in cell 3, look at the pile of papers. Okay, so this is a bit of a 20th century, maybe even 19th century theme here, or sort of way of displaying it, because we're not meant to print out paper anymore in the 21st century. But don't be too concerned about that. So the student asked the question right at the beginning, "Sir, did you read the draft I left on your desk?" And I replied, "I've looked at it." Now, the other 2 cells give us 2 very different interpretations of that 4-word phrase in the English language. I've looked at it. So the middle cell is what your student, the one that you are supervising, this is what they hope it means. And just ignore for the fact that you're saying this is amazing. That's like icing on the cake. What they really hope is you're looking at every page. You've read every paragraph. You've dwelled on every sentence and even some words you've sat there and thought about it. How long would that take? Look at all the pages. That's going to take hours. Is that going to happen? So here's my dark secret. No, it's not going to happen. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. I don't have the enthusiasm. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm a grumpy old man, but that's the dark secret. So I put it, and that's, we have a binary situation here, two extremes. One where it's read in detail. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the other one happens either, the final cell. All I'm doing is turning my head to the side and I'm looking at it at a distance. How much have I taken in? Nothing. It's going to be a disaster. The meeting's going to be a disaster. As a supervisor, it's going to be a disaster. You can imagine, I can tell you, I can play it out for 5 seconds, what I'd be doing in the meeting. And basically, and you can't see it because of my background, but I'm waving pages around here because I'd be frantically trying to find something in the 25, 30 pages there that I can relate to in some way and comment on. And it just won't work. So both of these are extreme. The reality would be somewhere in between. But let's dwell on the final cell. It's labeled what it probably means. I've looked at it. If as researchers we do that, we're not doing a very good job. And you might say, well, and I, part of the problem is, well, we're time constrained. The students given us too much to read. So you could try and land it back on them, but that's slightly unfair because we probably gave them no guidance on how to give us a streamlined piece of information. So to me, there's three problems. The first is communication. The second's communicate. In fact, they're all communication. It's a communication breakdown. So the communication that we're after, we're the supervisors, we're the academic expert, and we want a communication to happen. Now, it's a two-way street and we have to help guide them. Well, I've got great news for you. I've got what I believe is a perfect tool to get this communication across. And you don't have 25 pages, you have 2 pages. And it's structured as I have here, where you say to your student, these are the things I want you to tell me about. You've got 1,000 words, that will be enough. When you're done, send me the 1,000 words. And trust me, if they do a half reasonable job, those 1,000 words will be gold. Because even if you have not read that material prior to the meeting, you can scan through it. You're the expert in the field. You can scan through it pretty quickly and you'll have so much more than 30 minutes of things to discuss. It is a communication breakthrough for you. This is the tool. If you've not seen it before, if you've not tried it before, this is the biggest present that I've ever given you in your entire life. Well, I've given you no presents before, so it must be. This is my gift to you. And what are those items? Well, none of them are a surprise to you. But what this does is give you, in a nice, neat package, in groups that I think make a lot of sense, the first 4 items, the 4 big picture anchors: working title, basic research question, key papers, motivation puzzle. What I would, as a supervisor, what I would say to the student is, use these 4 to frame the bigger picture of your research. And with that, your supervisor will really appreciate it because they need to be informed of what you think that bigger picture is. And the rest of the pitch is then about your project. So you drill down. The next 3 items are very intentionally packaged together. these are the essential building blocks. And by and large, this is where the student is telling you, the supervisor, how they're going to go about doing their research that links to that bigger picture. The idea, well, that's a little, that's probably more what, but then the two how questions, data and tools. And as a package, you can make a call on what you like, what you don't like around that. And a lot of that call might be, as I mentioned earlier, how close are they to the gold standard in the field in terms of data, tools? If they're not right at the gold standard, is there a good reason why they aren't? And are they sufficiently close that this is still a viable project? And there are a lot of constraints out there in different research settings where sometimes you just can't get to the gold standard, but you can make a case for still a legitimate and valuable piece of research to take place. So then we have the two key questions. So I'd be saying to my student, that's, you've given me the how. Now I want to know, well, in fact, the next three are why, are different flavors of why. The two key questions, tell me why it's new. What's new about it? What's the essential element of it that's new? And then so what? So being new is not the end of the story. You have to, I'd be saying to my student, I want you to create a project where it's not only new and novel, but that new and novel thing people actually care about. There's little point doing something new and novel where no one cares about it. And then the bottom line to all this is the contribution. And so we even at an early stage, we want our research HDRs, where they're supervisors, we want them to tell us as best they can where they think the contribution element lies. Now, there are other considerations that often come into play that won't be captured by any of the 10 items above. So one that I like to throw in here, but it's just an illustration, is, well, what's your target journal? Now, in fact, knowing what the realistic, not the aspirational, but the realistic set of target journals are, will allow us to calibrate some of our expectations around the answers to the items that are above the other considerations in this framework. So I like to think of a cocktail glass to reflect what I've just told you. So it's a 4, 3, 2, 1 plus 1 design. And what I like about the cocktail glass is it gives that wedge image. And really it is about, you've got 4 things to explain, 3 things, 2 things, and then it all comes down to the holy grail. What's the bottom line for your research? So if I were sort of advising my student, okay, and there'd be detailed advice, but broad advice about how to attack this problem, I only want 2 pages. Okay, if you have, going back to an old-fashioned metaphor, if you have to staple or use a stapler, then you've written too much. So it should be on either side of one sheet of paper in a 20th century sort of way of thinking. It's 1,000 words. Now, you don't have to land exactly on 1,000 words, plus or minus 20% is fine. And then in terms of the golden rule, so here's my advice to you in terms of as a supervisor, these 5 golden rules that I really like. So apart from the specific content of each item, which you're the expert in the field and you'll be able to react to, I think these 5 things sort of hover above that to help give an additional element of guidance. It should be clear and focused and to the point. It should be meaningful. So all the information should be meaningful rather than throwing in some, boilerplate, very general motherhood statement, things that really don't help. Make it meaningful. You only have 1,000 words. Make it clear you put in an effort. Okay, so a big sign of a lack of effort is where I find students, it's like they've just discovered copy and paste. And so they're copy and pasting everywhere because they think there's, all these items are just the same, asking the same thing. It should be connected. It should be connectivity. And so you can have situations where individual answers to items in the framework make sense, but when you put them together, they're disconnected and they're confusing. And then the one that rounds it all up for me and links back to the cartoon strip that I used a few slides ago, it should start a conversation. There should be communication, but the goal is not perfection. So don't tell your student that you're supervising to perfect it, because they'll be wasting time. I mean, the nature of research, it's a moving feast. The goalposts move. And that when their ideas change and evolve and sort of move, then the definition of perfection, well, it either moves or it's not relevant. So what I say to my students instead, do the best you can, knowing it will not be perfect. If you can start a conversation, and a meaningful conversation with this, you've had success, because that's what you want. You want advice. You want detailed advice from an expert in the field. Now, sometimes I get asked, well, if it's 1,000 words, how would you divide them up? Would you have the same number of words for each element? And well, no, I think we can divvy it up a little bit, so it sort of goes in certain directions. And I won't go, this is suggestive. I'm not saying everyone has to agree with this, but I've found it's quite helpful as a rule of thumb. The one that I would say, if anything, deserves more words than the rest, for me, is motivation. So, I think 200 words, 20% of the budget is quite reasonable there, because the way I think of motivation, if I could just use it to illustrate some more specific guidance I would give, and I don't have time to go in any depth to the others. But for me, I follow the rule of three whenever I can, and I've got a rule of three for motivation. So the first thing I'd like to see from my student that I'm supervising is a statement, or one or two sentences that tells me the state of play. What do we currently know in the broad field? Remember, hovering a little bit above the project they want to do. State of play for this field intellectually. That's number one. Number two is, with that as the background, where is a major area of uncertainty regarding the current state of knowledge? Now, I don't want to use the word gap. Sometimes people describe it as gap, but I don't like the word gap, because I think people become too gap focused. Then it's like, oh, all I've got to do is find a gap. So I'm not going to use it, even though I've used it 3 times just then. So state of play, where is the deficiency in knowledge that's relevant here? But it's sort of at a hovering. I see students that I supervise want to jump straight to their research and define that. No, go a level above. So that general area of deficiency of knowledge. So what do we know? What don't we know? And then the third part of this rule of three is, why is it important to know or get an answer to that piece where we have a deficiency? What do we know? What don't we know? Why do we need to know? To me, if a student can hit those 3 in their motivation, 200 words, then they're doing a great job. So we certainly don't have time for any examples. I'm going to point you to where you can see some written examples, but one of my favorite video examples is by Keris Downing. You can view it on YouTube with this link. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's a very good one. I ran a pitching competition at UQ for many years, and Keris was actually the runner-up in 2017. So as an oral pitch and as an oral example of this framework, I think it's really nice. So where can you learn more? Well, if you didn't already know, as a supervisor, this is your go-to. And I apologize to any of you that, and maybe quite a number of you have now accessed this, but this is a great gift I've given you here. I believe it's like what you do in your very first meeting with your students, or if you have got a research process class or something, you ask your students to access this paper, read it, and come to the next class or the next meeting ready to discuss. And that is already kickstarting your role as a supervisor. And it has a lot of detail in there that we haven't had a chance to scratch at in this session. So that is the go-to. You know, everyone's allowed to be passionate about something that they've created. And for me, this is it. I've published over 350 papers. And if there's only one thing of mine that you ever read, this should be it. Forget about the rest. Everything else I've done is worthless. This is essential for you and your students. And, you know, I would think you're crazy. And I use that with the greatest respect, and I don't want to upset you, but you'd be crazy not to utilize this resource. It's totally free. And it just so happens today was a major milestone, 21,000 downloads. It's 157th in the all-time rank of SSRN downloaded papers. Now it's getting, you know, one has to be a little careful to get too obsessed by this, but I have noticed that, you know, given COVID, there's a bunch of COVID papers, not really business related, they're more the health ones. They've had like 90,000 downloads in a few months or a year. So they just go streaming past. So that's really hard competition in a way to make your mark in terms of penetration. But this is an important metric for me. I don't wish to abuse it, but to me, this symbolizes and signifies, well, it's scratching the surface. There are millions of researchers out there, and I think I can help a lot of them. So, you know, I hope I've encouraged you to use this as supervisors with your students. You could have a look at a masterclass, 48-minute video that goes through in a little bit more detail the pitching research framework. You could ask your students to watch that. There's a 9-minute primer animation that you could also use. So how does this all come together? How does this all come together then for pitching responsible science? And I'm just about finished, so if you could mute, that would be great. But, and it does tie into some of the things I mentioned earlier about responsible science and the crisis. And so we have pitching research framework down on the left-hand side, ex post, ex ante version, responsible science, either the credible research or relevant research pillars. And so the intersection of credible research and ex post use of pitching research is a replication pitch. And I encourage students when they're thinking about, or when I ask them to do a replication, to actually pitch it to me first. And I certainly ask that in the Pacific Basin Finance Journal section that I've created. I talked about pre-registration. You could have a pre-registration pitch, which is the intersection of credible research and ex ante, and then an intersection of relevant and ex ante would be what I call an engagement and impact pitch. And I've got a companion paper that looks at this. And if anyone's interested, I can point you to that. I'm pretty much going to wind up now in 60 seconds. The rest of the slides are self-explanatory. So goal 3, helping use the supervisors with other resources that are going to make your life easier. So the one-stop shop for all things pitching is something we've been working hard on. And so click on that or go to that link. You get greeted by your research journey starts here. So imagine your student, you've sent them to this site and you say to them, explore the site. Now we can see across the top, there's an Inspires network, which I'll mention at the very end in about 30 seconds. Events and competitions. We've just run a big global pitching research competition. Some of you, many of you might be aware of that. And the resources tab. And it's the resources tab that I would send students to have a look. Now, module 1, responsible science matters. I've given you a flavor of that now, but there's more resources there. Module 2, pitching research matters. I've given you a flavor of that as well. And there are other modules there as well. So module 2, for example, have these different elements. But what I'm very excited to tell you is coming soon, we've been working at Bond University with some colleagues on available entirely free to the world. And that was a bit of a battle to convince my university to make it free. It's a formal version of Module 2, and we've structured it so your students, you could send them there and they could do effectively 10 hours of learning content to get a fairly good exposure to the pitching research framework. And it includes formative assessment and quizzes, and they'll end up, if they complete the micro-credential, an official certificate of completion at the end. There's an online library of written examples at this link. And finally, I want to mention to you, for those that don't know, created last year an International Society of Pitching Research for Responsible Science. I invite you to become a member and your students because, well, we've just run our pitching competition, but we're working vigorously to develop online resources that will include, not just at the moment, the ability to create a pitch where you have guidance, but also to get feedback. So we're going to have, we're building a feedback element to this as well as an assessment element. So all of that will be rolled out very soon, we hope, or as soon as we can. So I'm sorry for possibly, I had in my mind 45 minutes and the timer at the moment is up to 46.5. So I thank you very much. I hope you found that interesting and helpful. I'm not entirely sure whether we got time for questions. If we don't have time for questions, that's fine. I can take them via email or whatever. But I'll hand it back to Imran. And I don't want you to blow the time budget for your session. If there is time for questions, I'm happy to. If there's not, that's fine by me as well. Thanks, thanks, Imran.
Great job. Imran is muted. Imran, you're muted.
You there, Imran?
I think he's disconnected probably. While we're waiting for him, I don't think there's going to be question and answers.
No.
I just want to make one observation. It's a great piece of summary. I'm sure every guy who wants to be a supervisor. Now, we learned it the hard way, you and me. Frank taught me the framework that you're showing there, but he didn't put it in A to K, but he just put it in 3 points, ABC. And we used to prepare a one-page summary every time we meet him. And those things were typed in those days. We didn't have a computer. So it's a great guidance. Either you learn it by heart, which you did, which I did. I'm sure the people are listening to you. If they're serious about good supervision, they should use that in addition to all the resources you have created. Thank you from my heart. Bye.
Oh, thank you, Ray.
So it looks like he's still disconnected.
So, yeah, well, there's one question typed in. So, I mean, if Imran comes back, I'll shut up.
Go ahead.
Unless we just go to the next, maybe Doug go. Doug, should we wait for Imran or do you want to have a go?
I'm happy to get started if that's okay. Questions thereafter for you subsequent to.
Well, I'll have to leave, sorry, because it's 10 p.m. here in Brisbane. So.
Oh, I see. Okay.
A bit late.
Well,
apologies.
nice to see you. Not at all. Nice to see you. Cheers.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
So, thanks very much. I am pleased to join you. And my talk is going to, I guess, nicely complement Robert's talk in the sense that, oh, sorry, let me just do one. I want that to come up in that way. Not sure if you see the
We
right
can read
slides
it.
here.
We
Okay,
can read
I'll try that one more time. Here, share screen. There we go. There, that might be a bit better. Good. So I think this will nicely complement Robert's talk insofar as I'll talk a little bit more about the details of publishing and things that you can recommend to students from a supervisory perspective, and tips for yourself as well on publishing. So hopefully this is helpful. And of course, anytime you get a vice assessment myself, but if it's not something that I'm intimately familiar with, then I immediately go to Google Scholar and I'll type in either the title of the slide or of the paper, or I will type in some keywords associated with the paper. And I'll do a few different searches to make sure that prior work is properly cited. And if the work, does not have citations that Google Scholar deemed to be the most relevant, then that immediately gets my backup that the relevant work hasn't been acknowledged properly, and or the author doesn't know what the relevant work is. And that will likely lead to a desk rejection if that's the case. Secondly, if it's an empirical paper, I look to see when and where the data are from. So for example, if the data are old, especially if the data are more than a decade old, then that might imply the paper's been rejected in other journals for many times, or that the author hasn't bothered to update the paper. And that could be a problem in the sense that other scholars are less likely to find the paper interesting, and it's not going to do the journal any good to publish this kind of thing because it's much more likely to receive scant or zero citations. Another concern that I'll consider is whether or not there exists data from other countries that have been ignored. So many data vendors these days sell data for a variety of countries, and so a single country study might be less interesting if data from multiple countries are available, because the single country study could reflect institutional considerations from that particular country that are not applicable elsewhere, or make the paper less generalizable to a global audience. So if you have multi-country data, you shouldn't ignore it. And that includes, for example, only doing US only studies. So if you have US data and you could have used international data, then you should use international data if it's pertinent to your research question. Thirdly, seeing typos is a bad problem. Grammar mistakes, typos, if they're visibly apparent the data in the paper, then I get very discouraged. If tables are not formatted properly, that's bad. Most papers these days should have descriptive headers. A lot of journals like to see papers that are standalone in terms of their tables. What that means is that the reviewer or reader should be able to read the entire set of tables and figure out what's going on in the paper without actually having to refer back to the paper itself. Papers that have standalone tables tend to be much more often cited than otherwise. In cover letters, you can tell me about potential conflicts of interest with the paper in terms of who might be a potentially bad reviewer for you, or you could even recommend reviewers. What I've noticed in cover letters when people recommend reviewers, and if I pick them, then those types of individuals are much more likely to be hostile than not. So frequently people don't appreciate who their friends are. And some of the journals that I edit, for example, the British Journal of Management has a place to even recommend reviewers. And we've seen statistics on this that recommended reviewers are much more likely to recommend rejection than otherwise. And so if we think a paper should be rejected or potentially rejected, then indeed picking the recommended reviewers is something that often gives a much more harsh referee report. It's great to have a new topic in area. Papers that are simply redoing another study with the data from a different country tends to be what they call a Me Too paper. Definitely less interesting. Papers, empirical papers that do not provide a description of the economic magnitude of the effects. So the empirical paper only describes statistical significance without describing the size of the effects. Those types of projects are ones that tend to not work very well in terms of being informative for the reader. You can't just do a write-up for your results and say, well, this variable has 3 stars, this one 2 stars, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an interesting write-up. And then finally, Robusta checks for empirical work can be very helpful. Lots of papers these days produce an online appendix that accompanies the paper. I've seen online appendices much more than 100 pages, for example. So you can have very lengthy online appendices that deal with potential criticisms of the paper that reviewers might indicate, and that type of thing can be very helpful and useful. So I often get the question, well, what's interesting to work on? And the nice thing about our job is that you don't have to pick anything at all other than what you're interested in. And so things that I find interesting these days include crowdfunding or financial technology more generally. Some advantages to crowdfunding research and fintech is that data sets tend to be large, easy to access. It's not very costly to get the data, particularly if you're good at programming with Python or other things to scrape the web. I've noticed that that's an area that receives a lot of citations, and it appeals to a variety of different areas. So people in finance, entrepreneurship, marketing, and management information systems, strategy, and international business, amongst others, all seem to intersect at this area of research. Second area I like these days involves market manipulation, traders doing bad things. As I've been able to merge different data sets and intersect topics that people haven't done before. And lastly, I've done some fun stuff merging blue collar crime topics with entrepreneurship and finance using international data. On the crowdfunding side, we do in fact have a recent book on crowdfunding, if that's something that you're interested in. The PowerPoint slides that accompany the book are available online for free. So what have I done in the past that has helped me, and things that I would advise that I often advise students to do is that I always agree to write review reports unless it's a journal that I view as being a predatory journal or one that demands that the report be produced within 2 weeks, and it's not feasible for me to do it within 2 weeks. But if you disagree to write a review report, or if you do a bad job on the review report, then your name enters into the system of the journal as someone that has not agreed to review for the journal. And so the next time you want to submit a paper to the journal, and there's a record of how many times you've not agreed to review for the journal, or a record of bad quality reports produced for the journal, then that would certainly not bode well for you in terms of your chances of publishing in that journal. So you want to agree to do the reports, do a timely job on the reports, and do a high quality job on the reports. That sort of builds your reputation and even builds a database about you that the journals all have about who is useful and good to review for the journal and who is going to be a good citizen. And in turn, editors will likely be more friendly to you if you, in fact, do that work for the journal. I do tend to attend many conferences. I tend to be friendly to folks. I've seen people attend conferences and be quite nasty in their discussions of other papers, and that typically doesn't help anybody. I work with many co-authors, and I like to joke that I even married one of my co-authors. Very helpful thing to do. And then I have a large portfolio of papers so that, you know, I'm not putting all my eggs in one basket, so to speak, so that if you have bad reviewers or bad luck with reviewers or someone's trying to block you, then your, you know, career chances aren't killed by resting on one particular paper. Finally, I've had the odd experience of a paper that I've submitted to the journal and tried to keep blind by not having posted on the internet anywhere, and that's not worked out well for me in the sense that someone else has actually subsequently and quickly worked on that particular topic. So things that I found easier to publish, novel papers, new data. So if it's a brand new topic or new data, then those things tend to get editors and reviewers more excited. I found it very hard to publish papers that say someone before you did it wrong. And likewise, I found it harder to publish papers based on single country studies that do not use US data. So that latter point is changing over time, but certainly not quick enough. And so I often gravitate towards multi-country data sets wherever possible. Yeah, so papers that I like are ones that are not merely replicating a study with some other country. You should spend tons of time writing and rewriting your abstract and introduction. My supervisor told me back in the 1990s that you're very lucky if someone reads your abstract, and even luckier if they read your introduction. And if they don't like it, they're not going to continue. So the abstract and introduction should be absolutely perfect. You should rewrite it and rewrite it as many as 10 times, in fact. Keep going back to it. Make sure you've conveyed your ideas as clearly as possible. Because if not, then people aren't going to read further and they're less likely to read your work again in the future. You should have lots of summary statistics, robustness checks, online appendices, discuss economic and statistical significance. The data, you know, we've talked a bit about this already, but indeed recent data, some journals have this bias towards US data. You need to be aware of that. Multi-country data sets tend to be better. I'm Canadian. I made the mistake early in my career of working with Canadian only data, and then subsequently realized nobody cares about Canada. You know, so that's not a good strategy to use Canadian only data. If you're going to use international data, try to use multi-country data sets. Sometimes you encounter reviewers in narrow topic areas that are trying to block you. So if it's a niche topic area and you've discovered that someone who did it previously did it wrong, then they might in fact have a lot of power over you to block you. And so things that you could do are switch journals, possibly even switch fields. So if you're in finance, you might switch to entrepreneurship or management to publish the same topic. It's worthwhile to market your ideas at conferences and generate a network of people that support your work. That type of thing can help you to eventually find a friendly reviewer. And then in terms of your other profile, you need to start building up your citations and other papers that are in the same area of work. And so indeed, you might have some short-term pain, but overall you'll have longer-term benefit. Unfortunately, our job is one that is not a level playing field. Some editors that are time constrained might prefer established and connected authors. And so part of our job is to figure out where your paper has the best chance, thinking about which journal might be open to giving you a reasonable shot. You know, you have to think about which places to cite, citing friendly authors and reviewers, as opposed to those that don't give you the time of day. A lot of people wonder, you know, and they'll ask their supervisors, is it worthwhile to write a single author paper or to get a co-author with a big name? This is certainly a trade-off. You know, the sometimes people overplace weight on senior co-authors, thinking it's going to help sell the paper. Sometimes it indeed does help sell the paper, although it can come with costs in terms of your contribution gets diminished and timeliness. Some people are too busy to work on additional things. And if you do have at least one sole author paper, there can be long-term benefits so that other people can see the type of work that you do. If you are going to co-author with someone, you should know the terms, if it's alphabetically organized or not. Many people in economics and finance don't want to work on papers if they're not alphabetical because they get heavily discounted otherwise. And it, you know, in the end, it's perhaps worthwhile with co-authors if it has long-term partnerships, but sometimes they involve short-term costs and do not work out very well. So you have to think about that. Advice to give students, things that not to do. So firstly, don't submit the same paper to different journals at the same time, thinking you will get away with it, because there are databases and systems to check. So that's a bad thing to do. You shouldn't falsify information, like making up data, or falsifying data, and indeed there are stories of people getting caught about this. Results that are not replicable. I put an example from the accounting review where a paper was recently retracted from some authors from previously were at Carnegie Mellon University, and it led to both of those authors not getting tenure there. With co-authorship, it can be troublesome if you drop a co-author or change the order of their names. They might complain, which could lead to problems for you with the journal. And then, you know, finally, the obvious about copying and falsifying references, those aren't good things to do. Now, sometimes you see authors publish that are pressuring or threatening others, including threatening editors. As an editor myself, I've been threatened that if I didn't publish their paper, they would sue me. They would, if I didn't take a proposal for a paper, a set of papers, for a special issue, then they would say bad things about me to other journal editors. So indeed, those are not helpful things for your long-term benefit. It's not worthwhile to email an editor asking where their referee report is after 6 weeks, even 4 weeks. You see that is, you know, you're thinking, boy, you don't know how the system works if you think you're demanding a report within that period of time. Often journals try to get that within that time period, but they're subject to the reviewers replying to them on time. And then if you complain about negative reports, that often doesn't work well. The only times when that can work well is if there's an absolutely clear mistake about what has been done in the referee report. If it's not an obvious mistake on behalf of the reviewer, then it's not worthwhile to complain. Some editors and journals are reputed as having problems with misconduct. So they might edit a colleague's paper. They might publish work that they know is incorrect, helping their colleagues. They might unduly consider work from only certain authors from certain universities. And so for example, there's a journal in the Boston area where 1/3 of the publications are from other authors in the same Boston area. And I'm not going to name the journal, I hate to get myself into trouble, but it's well known what journal that is. But those are things that you want to think about if you think you're going to have a reasonable shot at publishing at that journal. So just be savvy and discuss your options before you waste your time submitting to places. So just quickly, a couple of policies with journals where I'm involved with. Firstly, at the British Journal of Management, you can nominate reviewers, but as I say, you need to be careful because more often than not, the nominated reviewers are ones that are going to recommend rejection. So people that you think are your friends tend to not be your friends. And so you have to think about that very carefully. We do try to be quick with our turnaround. So we tell our reviewers to get us their reports back within a month. And typically they do, partly because we're very explicit about telling our reviewers that we keep a database about their review history. And so if they're late, it shows up in the database that they submitted a review late. or if they give us a bad quality review, that too shows up in the database. And so with reviews back within a month, typically the whole process takes about a month and a half if the reviewers are on time, but it could take a little bit longer if the reviewers are late. But a month and a half is sort of what we hope for, to allow time first for the paper to come in, to see if it fits with the style check from the managing editor. So it takes about a week before it goes to reviewers. And then it might take even a second week for us to find suitable reviewers. And then subsequently, after getting the reviews back, we too have to read the paper, assess the quality of the reviews. And so that might add another week as well. We do have an annual call for special issue proposals every December. We do not consider proposals for special issues outside the annual call because we have a process with the British Academy of Management that requires us to be open, fair, and transparent to rank proposals and not merely give special issues to colleagues or friends. We often desk reject papers to help speed up the decision for people that, or papers that do not have a chance for reasons that I indicated above. So in fact, about 60% of our papers are desk rejected. And lastly, at the British Journal of Management, we publish everything: finance, management, strategy, international business, HRM, entrepreneurship, economics, etc. So any topic area is suitable for BJM. We have a relatively new journal where they've been publishing papers for a couple of years now. We've had great authors, Franklin Allen, Alan Berger, amongst other well-known scholars, Renee Adams, Tim Jenkinson, great folks are submitting to us. So we're very happy about the progress. We typically get 2 reviews per paper. Again, we too have fast turnaround time. We demand reports within a month. We have all our policies posted online, and if you just Google Review of Corporate Finance, you can see our forthcoming and published papers. So please do take a look if that is of interest. So just a few last thoughts. The importance of conveying to people that you're supervising, be a good citizen, because that builds up your reputation in the long run. And, it takes a long time to be a good citizen and build up a reputation. So building a reputation can take, a whole career, but it only takes a second to kill a good reputation. So you don't want to do bad things. So, if you have, 20 years of doing good things, then all of a sudden you're caught multiple submitting papers, or you resubmit a rejected paper, or you do something bad like threatening others or steal someone's idea, that kind of thing, then all that effort of building your reputation can be killed, and it can make it very hard for you to ever publish again. Other things you want to avoid, like publishing work that is wrong, improperly referencing, faking data, other types of things. So just make sure you do not do those things after you've done such a hard effort to build a good reputation. And then finally, the last thing I just want to say is that, if you're supervising PhD students towards a good job to be an assistant professor, one of the times that involves some personal things that you should help them out with. So, in terms of the colleagues that they're going to get at their new place, how to be a good colleague at your new institution. There are stresses involved in that switch. So, assistant professors sometimes abused at the new university that they work with. They might face competitive pressures. There's a personal element of having a lot of fun as a student where everybody wants to talk to you. And then when you're a professor, you're all of a sudden isolated because people are now afraid to talk to you. It's tough teaching classes for the first time, so preparing lecture notes and all that kind of thing. So those are also things that we should be cognizant of as we're helping our PhD students move to their first job. So that's everything that I did want to say, and hopefully I picked us back up on our schedule to get us more back on time. And thank you again for the chance to share some thoughts with you.
Professor Douglas, it's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for your time
Likewise, good to see you.
to conduct
Thanks.
this timely webinar. It was a lovely session. Thank you very much. And I think if any of the audience has questions, they may raise their hand. Then I'll unmute. So I think people are tired.
Yeah, it's all fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to entertain emails or discussions at any point in the future. So feel free to get in touch with me anytime. Thank you.
Yeah. So
I see someone in the chat box asked if there is a way to raise hand. Or you could just speak up. But yeah, there is a hand raise button on the Zoom picture.
So there is, I think there is a participant. He wanted to ask a question. Yes, Nazim Hussain. Okay, let me unmute him. Nazim Hussain. Yeah. Yeah, Nazim Hussain, you can unmute yourself, please.
Well, thank you very much. I hope, Ahmed Imran, you can hear me, and Professor Douglas Cumming, thank you very much for your nice presentation. I am from Netherlands, and I am a bit experienced. I have already supervised a couple of PhDs, and I already asked my question in the chat, and I would like to know your thoughts about it. That most of the time when we start supervising a PhD student, what we challenge with is how to promote that, how do the PhD students think independently, and then how to keep them motivated later on. These are two main challenges, because PhD students get frustrated very quickly because they do not know what right now, at least after doing PhD and after having a tenure, we know, and like how to overcome these challenges. I would like to know your thoughts about it. Thank you.
Great. Those are brilliant questions. And indeed, you know, the independent thinking is really our main job. Is if we graduate a student without fostering their independent thinking, then that's going to be a problem. So I remember back in my PhD days, we had an issue of my supervisor, you know, forced me, and he said he wouldn't graduate me unless I had a sole authored paper. And so that's a question that has come up repeatedly over the years since I've been working as a professor. This basic question: should PhD students be obligated to produce sole authored research? One trouble with that increasingly over time is that in certain fields, data are quite expensive. And so, you know, if you're working with easily accessible, publicly available data sets, then the types of papers that you can write are perhaps not as novel as newer topic areas with data that can become quite expensive. So as an example of this, some of the areas that I work in include private equity and venture capital. And, you know, in that field, recent data include data, for example, from PitchBook, and PitchBook has great data, but access to the data is at least $50,000 US a year for a subscription. And so if your university does subscribe to that, then great. But if not, then you know you need to work with someone who actually has personal access to that data, which necessarily demands co-authorship. So indeed, there are trade-offs there that students face, and on each case you would have to evaluate that in a particular situation, so that students know that, you know, there might be access barriers without co-authorship. The other thing that I try to do with students is to encourage them, when they're thinking about new topics, that one great way to get a new topic is to merge data sets that have not been merged before. So, and to, you know, ask them to reflect on that issue so that they can indeed come up with their own topic areas and develop new research questions so that they don't face, you know, problems subsequently in their career once they've lost the immediate access to their supervisor about, well, geez, what am I going to work on now? So that can be a very helpful exercise for them to start developing their own research profiles and agendas, as opposed to simply following that of their former supervisors. So yeah, those are two common things that I've encountered. If possible, I think it's great to encourage students to have at least one sole author paper if possible, but if that is not possible, then it's, you know, strongly recommended that you encourage them to reflect on ways to generate new ideas, including, for example, this idea of merging data sets. It could involve other things to you know, develop their own profile, but eventually students are going to have to, you know, move on from being a PhD student to working as an assistant professor, and doing so, you know, is going to take some EQ as opposed to just purely IQ. They need to, you know, figure out how they're be able to sell their research going forward. So a tough issue, but one that we continually have to evolve. I guess as a further suggestion, I currently have a PhD student who's really quite an independent go-getter, and one thing that he's done is started investigating ways in which students, he himself as a student, can apply for research grants. And so if there are ways for students to get those applications out, then that could really jumpstart their career and their own research agenda. So if that's feasible in the particular country that you're in, then that could be a very helpful thing.
Thank you very much. This is really a nice suggestion to ask for applying for funding, because there are numerous opportunities here. Thank you so much once again.
Excellent. Likewise. Thanks.
Sir Cumming, here is another participant, Hasnan Ahmed. He has a question. Hasnan, can you unmute, please? Hasnan Ahmed, can you unmute, please?
Sir.
No.
Hasnan, unmute, please. Okay, I think Stan has left us. So I think we don't have any other question from the participants.
No problem. I think we're right on time. At least my time is 8:46, so I'm 1 minute over. So I'm glad we kept us back on schedule. Thank you again for the chance to participate with you. I much appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to the next one. Thank you.
Stay blessed. Stay blessed. Now, Professor Ariff, it's your turn, please.
Okay, thank you. I've been waiting for that. Okay, I'm not having any PowerPoint slides. I have given up the idea of PowerPoint slides. They are meant to be guiding us, but what I'm going to talk about is based upon practical experience, and I don't need PowerPoint slides for that. It's just simply 3 points. And I'm going to look at your symposium as something where some experienced people like Robert Faff, Douglas, myself can share ideas. So I'm going to call it Supervision Quality. This symposium is about supervision quality. And I'm going to make just 3 points. Point A, what are the institutional development you need to create a good environment for good supervision. That's institutional arrangement. In other words, a superstructure that a university puts out to have a consistent, authentic supervision of students. Of course, it takes a long time. So that's the first point, institutional development. Those of you who wants to write it down, just put that one point, institutional development. I will spend about 5 minutes on that. Then I'm going to talk about supervision quality. What are the things, what are the ways we can judge supervision quality on the part of the supervisory team, as well as on the part of the student to meet that supervisory quality. And the third thing I'm going to say is cultural impediments from good quality supervision. Now, I added that with the approval of Imran because in Asia, it's a different ball game. I worked in 9 top universities in the world, out of which from 6 of them I produced PhD students, and mostly Western countries. And I have worked in Asia quite a lot. Half of my students who passed through my hands for supervision were Asians, okay? So I want to add that dimension, what I call cultural impediments in Asia that impedes what I would call supervision quality. So the 3 points are about supervision quality. First one is institutional development. What is the superstructure you put in place to have a genuine quality PhD program? Second point, what are the characteristics of supervision quality? And finally, what are the impediments to quality? Okay, let me start with the first one. It's based upon, all these insights are based upon 28 years of teaching in 9 top universities in the world. I wouldn't say that my current university is a top university, but all the others were famous research universities. I produced PhD students, I've taught in them. And as well as I have probably examined about 50 to 60 PhD finished job, for which I was the external examiner across the whole world, from China all the way to Sweden and Australia. So let me get into the first point, institutional development. Now, as I worked during the 28 years in several universities, one thing I observe is that there's a very high correlation between very well-established, carefully thought about institutional framework in a given university and the quality that framework encourages both the supervisor and the student to meet high standards. So what do I mean by that? I give you an example. I was a PhD supervisor in Melbourne, and there's so many universities there. I produced more than one. I think there are about 16 students I have supervised and completed in Melbourne. Now, if you compare with Monash or University of Melbourne, you have other universities, Deakin, RMIT. To be realistic, I have to quote their names. I have nothing against them. The institutional framework for good supervision are very different. Melbourne Uni and Monash Uni had a simple formula. You appoint 2 people who are experts in their area, and they don't have co-authorship as external examiners. And the decision is very simple. Both reports must point to an award of a PhD. Whereas in RMIT, they have 3 supervisors, 3 examiners, and they just take a majority decision. So I've often been there a couple of times, and I find that the most astute examiner could be someone who is blackballed because they don't like to disappoint the student. So that encourages very poor quality throughout the RMIT PhDs. I'm not saying they're not good, but that simple majority decision among the 3 as an expedient measure instead of 2 anonymous examiners appointed, and they both must agree. That's the standard, gold standard. Let's call it, that's a platinum standard. But you have many universities, you don't have platinum standard. They screw it up. They have 3 examiners. And in some universities, there's not even a filter for who could be the external examiner. The platinum standard is that guy whom you invite must be an established professor. And he should not have, published a paper together with the internal supervisors. You don't find it in the platinum standard, anybody violating that. But you take a university such as, say, Southern Cross, you don't find that kind of rules built into these institutional standards. So that encourages slippage over time. Let me give you an example. Long time ago, there was a paper in criminal science, and they compared the city of Paris and city of London. How many cases are solved, murder cases in London by Scotland Yard, and how many are solved over 100 years in Paris. And they found that Scotland Yard solved 95% of all murder cases. That means 5% of them, they couldn't find a killer. Whereas in Paris, it's not the police department that calls the investigation. It is the judge. A judge is appointed as a supervisor for the investigation of the cases. And they found that that simple lack of separation of power between the judge and the policeman leads to fewer cases being solved. In other words, the cases solved were somewhere like 80%. So whereas in London, with the separation of the power, judge cannot interfere with that. It is the Scotland Yard must do it. They created higher success rate. It's the same thing in supervising. The university is responsible for that. It is not the student. University must think through and put the highest platinum standard. So that's my first point. And I have supervised a student in University College Dublin. He's a Libyan guy, and we published in a top journal out of his. And you see the standard is very clear. They appoint 2 people who are independent examiners, and they go through, and then minor or major changes. That rule leads to good publication. So it has got a spillover effect, because if you have good institutional development standards, your PhD student will get better outcome, okay? So that's the first point. The second point is supervision quality. What's the quality of the supervision? Now we'll assume that I believe, after having produced about 48 PhD students in 28 years, intelligence is widely spread. It can be a Pakistani coming from, I have Pakistani students who graduate with me. It can be from China, it can be from Vietnam. It doesn't matter. All of human beings have that innate intelligence because their own school system filters them, and they come to us ready with a lot of brain, a lot of ability. But you find that if you assume that ability is there, why is that in some university supervision is not so good quality? So I want to touch upon it. The first thing is adequacy of education of the supervisors. Many third-rate universities want to get into the race. There's money for it. In Malaysia, you register for a PhD, you're paying something like 56,000 over 3 years. That's a lot of money. So third-rate universities in Malaysia will say, oh, come and do it. And a lot of people from foreign countries register with them. 56,000 ringgit is not a big money for a rich man's son. So what happens is that the professors who are there are unpublished. The adequacy of the professor assigned to supervise is completely inadequate. But because the employer wants to, earn some income, there are 23 private universities and 33 private universities and 20 state universities. There's an incentive in the system to have professors who are not highly qualified. So they don't look for good PhD from a good university. Number two, you could have a training for these guys. When I was working in Monash, we make sure they go through a 2-year training, and they have to understudy someone who has produced PhD student. You don't have all these things. That means inadequacy of the training of the supervisors. Therefore, the quality of supervision is very, very poor. And I also collected some data anecdotally. 100% of what they produce in some of these universities never get published in any Q1 journals. This is automatically the result of institution not being conscious about supervisory quality of the PhD supervisors. I had even one case where the master student was supervising a PhD, when the rule says master student cannot, it was hidden, okay? So that's the first point. The second point about supervision quality, adequacy of training. I don't think a fresh PhD is ready to supervise anybody, unless it's of Cumming standard or, Robert Faff for me, Soon after we became academic, we started supervising. That is 20 years ago. But now we have plenty of people with PhD, and they must be trained. In all the developed countries I work, they go through a 2-year assisted training. I don't see that in Malaysia. Even in the very top universities, a young boy or girl comes from, say, University of Dover in England, and straight away on coming in, supervise another PhD student in the state universities. Because state universities employ them as senior lecturers straight away once you get the PhD, whereas the private sector university only employs them as a lecturer. And they don't give you any training, and they're let loose. It's like letting the fox loose among the lambs. Very bad practice. So supervisors who are here, there are 80 of them were there before. Now many have signed off, they're about 60. They have to remember, you must go through training, and the institution must have some kind of a training, at least over 1 year, guided before you let loose to supervise them. And the third and final point about supervision quality, you cannot ask a potential lecturer or assistant professor to supervise unless they themselves have produced 2 to 3 Q1 standard publication. Because if you have not been through the school of publishing, you do not know what is publishing. You do not know how to identify high quality. That's what Robert Prof said. He breaks them into A to H. One of the items is, you have to know what's the end game, what's the contribution. But if you don't know, you're not trained, you have not published, how do you know? You have no right to supervise a young man or young lady's life for 3 years. It's a waste of time. That's a big part of one's life. So those 3 points are very important. Adequacy of education of supervisors. This is the university's responsibility. Adequacy of training for the supervisors. And of course, you also must make sure that they are selected only after they have 2 or 3 Q1 publication. You do not let loose someone who don't know the Q1 standard, let loose among the PhD student. And I'm assuming the 4th point, that all PhD students are brilliant students. You can't find fault with them. It is a guidance that's at fault. So that's point B, institutional development in terms of the structuring of the PhD and then the supervision quality. Finally, I want to concentrate, as I promised Imran, compare with Asia. It's particularly relevant to Asia. In the Western countries I've supervised, and I worked in Tokyo University, so I didn't supervise a student. I was assisting a student officially from United States to complete his PhD, but I was not officially appointed. You know how Japan is. If you're not part of the full-time staff, you cannot get involved. But the dean asked me, please, unofficially supervise. So I know what happens there. So you see 2 different worlds. In the Western world, the assumption is the student is independently pursuing under the guidance of a quality supervisor of the characteristic I just mentioned. But in Asia, it seems to be someone who is already a professor, he has a right to supervise, and the students accept it. In a sense, it creates what we call the students accept a status that I'm a subservient to the professor. So when I went there in 1991 to Tokyo University, I was teaching there. And then one day there was an American guy who was doing PhD. He came to my friend's office, Stanford PhD, and he cleaned the desk and then brought a cup of Japanese tea. And I asked him, why are you doing it? Oh, that's a normal. So from the very beginning, there is the master-slave relationship in Asia. I find it in Hong Kong. I found it in Singapore. Of course, Singapore University has lots of foreigners who brought fame, and they're graded, in the world number 27 last year. But the culture is the same. The PhD student is a slave to the master. I think that is not right, morally not right. And you have to fight against it because you put too much control of the supervisor on the student's life. In Tokyo, this guy later went to Federal Reserve Bank in New York. Now he's a chief accountant, an economist in a Korea Exchange Bank. He's a good friend of mine, Packer. And he couldn't even ask, when can I submit my PhD? They kept on postponing. You can't even ask. I said, go and ask your supervisor. He said, no, sir, that will be discourteous to the professor. And what he did was, he waited, and then one day he gave up, went to United States, Columbia University, got his PhD, and then he joined the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and then later resigned. He's a chief economist in the Korea, is an actual case. So in Asia, the culture of promoting independent professors of the future is missing. So there's not much respect for the PhD student. I think all you supervisors must keep an open door, fix a time to supervise, and never say, I'm busy today, I don't want to supervise. That is not respecting the independent and the responsibility. You've got to have a moral standard. And that's what I do. PhD student can come into my room anytime. All my students, all my staff also do the same. And we make appointment 1 week before. We never break the appointment unless there's a, fire in the building. So that's very important. The commitment to respect the future professors as your equal is very important. You start practicing. You don't wait for other people to tell you that. That's number one. Number two, the bright students who come to Asian universities are very shy to develop their own ideas. You say, you're the supervisor, sir, and they know there's a master-slave relationship. They let the supervisor dictate what they want to do. So this is a very bad example. I didn't see that in the 6 universities where I produced PhDs in the Western country, from Australia to United States and so on. So this is an aspect where I think the culture is very bad to accept that master-slave relationship leads to the students saying that it's a duty of the supervisor to identify. Oh, so what's the remedy against it? The supervisor must say, okay, like what Robert Prof said, I do the same. Within 3 months, I want a 3-page report, but every 2 weeks, I want a 1-page report where there's an announcement. Okay, thank you. Imran, sorry for that. Sorry to all those waiting to hear the second point. You got to tell the student, you give me in the first 3 months 1 proposal. Come up with anything. You must have some idea. They usually want to come up with the idea they want to change the whole world. One student came that they want to do a PhD in Islamic theory and finance that will change the entire financial structure of the world. I said, you are pretty stupid. That 3 months gone. Another student from Saudi Arabia came, it's your duty, sir, to help me to get my PhD. I mean, this is rubbish. It's your duty to get your PhD done. We are just a guide. Where is the independence? So I think as supervisors, all those 58 of us who are listening to this, avoid this trap that you are the one fountainhead of knowledge. Now, I have taught for 28 years. The more I become aged, I think I doubt many of the papers I wrote. I mean, we are not perfect. Everything has got limitation. You can use all the best panel regression, dynamic OLS, dynamic, whatever you may call it, all these new, you can use the, Python and all that. These are all tools. So those things are not important. What is the idea? What is the key idea? Just like what Robert said in that A to H. The key idea, glean it from the students. You don't offer it. You just suggest. There are many things. In the early days, I don't know what PhD students should do. But happy for me, a brilliant Myers on one of the chapters said there are 10 things still needing further studies. So I used to tell them, look at any one of the 10, okay? So don't fall into the trap of you being the leader of identifying. Throw them out, spend up 6 months, experiment with few ideas, and then finally settle something. Then they can take ownership. So the second idea is about ownership. The first idea is about, master-slave relationship we find in the Asian culture. You have to fight against it. Don't let the student treat you as a master. You treat them just as a colleague, the future professor. Second one is don't tell the student, this is what I want you to do. You can do that later. First, let him loose 6 months. Then you narrow him into something that's doable, not something that wants to change the whole world. I don't think any of us can change the world. Even Einstein said, E is equal to mc squared, blah, blah. But 25 years later, Professor Ahmed from Cambridge University came up with a new theory called the GUTS, Generalized Unified Theory. So none of us are perfect. So there's no perfect solution. So they have to understand that. And I think both Cummings and Robert Faff, mentioned that. Both of them I know very well, particularly Robert Faff. Robert Faff was employed when he was an associate professor in RMIT, and I was a chair professor in Monash. I invited him to join us as a full professor, research only, no teaching. And he worked there for 14 years. And I left after 14 years. He also left, went to Queensland. So he's an admirable character, very much focused on good research. And Douglas, I have met him on a dining table. I never shook hands with him. He works with some of the best people that I know in the world. So these are people who said the same thing. You must have an independent idea and they should take ownership. And the last point is that avoid this, simply put, avoid this. It is your duty as a supervisor to help the student to do a PhD. Never go that way. Particularly the rich countries like Libya, Saudi Arabia, all those rich countries, the students come from there. They say, oh, it's your duty, sir, to help us to do PhD. Demolish it on the first day. One fellow came to me and he said this. I said, I don't want to see you unless you refuse to make that statement. It's not my duty to help you. It's your duty to earn a PhD that will pass the examiners. And he never came back to me. That was in one of the best universities in Malaysia, in University Pertanian, Malaysia, in 2012. So he didn't come back to me after the meeting. So you rather not encourage this supplication, your duty to help, okay? I had a Malaysian student who was running away from his political problem because he was associated with a great politician, and CC packed up and went to Australia. But he passed his proposal defense, and he also said the same thing. You know, it's your duty, sir, to help me. I'm from Malaysia. So what? You could earn your PhD. And he's an associate prof in one unknown university in Australia after 12 years. So these three things are very important. Cultural impediments, okay? Quickly put, you have to avoid this master-slave syndrome. I never ask my PhD student to make a cup of tea. Neither do I take a cup of tea bought by him when I'm in the canteen. Create that kind of a distance so they must know that they have to be independent. Sense of leaving the topping to the supervisor, avoid it. At least 2 times you try him. You come up with the idea, I'll guide you. If it's not good, then you suggest, that's fine. And finally, avoid this duty to help, which is very paramount in Asia, okay? So in summary then, I just talked about 28 years of experience, having produced from 6 top universities, 48 students. And my own feeling is that the supervisor quality, the training and the education and the publication requirement is very important. If you're working in any university, make sure the quality of the supervisor is enhanced. This is the duty of the university. And I think the student must demand. They should not just be, hoodwinked someone who comes from a PhD from, University of Hull somewhere in England, and then he says, "Hey, come and do it with me." That's a disaster. I don't think you should take a novice to be your supervisor. You must be from good university, and also must have adequate training before becoming a supervisor. And finally, also must have good publication, at least 2 or 3 A-rated journal or Q1 journal. And that's supervision quality. And finally, of course, the regulatory framework, the superstructure that the university built must be meticulously put in order to encourage original work and a unanimous examiner decision. Not monkey business with that, have 5 examiners, we will take the majority decision. That kills a cat from the very beginning, and it will go down, like in the case of RMIT. There was one, I've been an external examiner for a couple of times, but there's one candidate who didn't have 1 paper in a Q1, and they want to promote him to full professor. I asked the chairman, he is not likely to be promoted in any Melbourne-based university. The answer he gave was, the administration wants him because he's on the TV every week. So he's giving publicity, and for that reason, they want to award him with the title, he earned his PhD. I was a dissenting voter. From that day, they never invited me, okay? And they decided on the basis of majority of 2. So the superstructure is very important. You have to design a good superstructure. There are many examples of top universities. You just go through that, but don't try to monkey that system. Don't try to throw a spanner in the wheel. So I think I have made it very clear. Supervision quality, that's what we are talking about in this symposium, is very, very important. And the university has a big role to play. And I fail to see that in many universities. We also fail to see the standard of the kind of structure that controls the award of PhD must be high quality, platinum standard, as I said. And I think the supervisory team quality must also be platinum standard. But if you're not a top university, at least gold standard. But don't go and take a silver standard for choosing the supervisor's training. And finally, be aware in Asia of the cultural element. And that is not going to lead to good future professors. It's a master-slave relationship. And thank you very much, Imran, for inviting me. I know this is pretty late. I think out of the 83, 28 of them have dropped out. So maybe it's an advantage to start first. Everybody's there. If there's some question, I will still answer. It is 9:15 in Malaysia, and I'm
Thank
still
you
in
very
the
much.
office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ariff. I think maybe any of the participant has question. They can raise their hand. Then we can take few questions.
Yep.
I think people are tired. It's dinner time.
I'm
Yeah.
sure they're learning, because we're all learning all the time.
Exactly.
I just want to offer to you, I will send the email, and there's a set of PowerPoint slides. I've been
Yeah.
invited by many universities to train how to publish, how to guide supervision. I will send it to you. You can send to these 83 people, minus
Sure.
of us, they can share the detailed analysis. But what I said to you is from the impressions I had in supervising these 48 students and examining PhD.
Sure. Dear Professor, now I would like to request my respected head of department to conclude the session.
Much Dr. Ahmed Imran for organizing such a wonderful symposium at Ghazi University, Dera Ghazi Khan. In conclusion, this symposium mainly focuses on fundamental issues towards effective supervision, capacity building, new trends, and innovative approaches for the timely completion of graduate research work, common practices of supervision in developed and developing countries, publishing tips for PhD students' work, helping supervisors to publish thesis work, transitioning from a PhD student to an academic position, the importance of pitching research in the relevant field. We, Department of Business Administration, would like to thank our distinguished expert, Professor Robert from Australia, Professor Douglas Cumming from USA, and Professor Muhammad Ariff from Malaysia. Finally, we further extend our sincere gratitude to our worthy Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Muhammad Tufail Tamgha Imtiaz, for his unwavering support to promote research culture, for providing us an opportunity to conduct these types of very important and timely symposiums at the institution. We request our distinguished guests to support us to conduct these types of events in the future.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Professor, thank you very much. Actually, I had some technical issue and I could not join, but lastly, I was able to hear your talk.
Yeah,
And believe me, I totally agree with your comments. Beautiful comments, beautiful talk from all the three professors, from all the three speakers. I think this kind of knowledge sharing is beauty of the knowledge, and we always learn from each other. Always we get many things. There is this university, Ghazi University, is just at the initial stages. So what you talked in your talk, we are trying our best to establish such kind of things, because I had much exposure from outside. Stayed in Japan for almost 15-16 years physically. Then came Saudi University, Saudi Arabia, and then I learned from many people like you. So because to my understanding, the quality research is not only critical or important for the socio-economic development of a country or any country we see in the world. The countries leading the world, they have the quality research and well-established quality education systems. But very unfortunately, in cases like we people, there is no such kind of system. But because quality research is important not only for the progress or the development of the country, but it also plays a first-rate or excellent teaching force as well. because ultimately we have to produce good leaders. So that is only possible when we train them, and my all focus is on the faculty, honestly, because this is, we are in the initial stages. So I very honestly, when I make a comparison with the things or with the international standards or other standards, and if someone asks me a question that, okay, there are so many components critical or important for establish a university, and how would you say if someone asks you that what should be the single component important for that? And straight away, without any hesitation, I would say that is the only faculty. So quality faculty, quality teacher. So in our system, this master-slave interaction that prevails. It's very, stupidly. And it's going on still. There is no such kind of course, there are always exceptions there. Mm-hmm. I have many friends from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from the West world, and all, of course, from Japan. Many people I got the chance to teach them and to impart training, especially in integrated pest management to JICA trainees. So Alhamdulillah, today's talk was a beautiful talk. I could not participate initially, but my heart is, it seems that you touched my heart, honestly. Beautiful. All Dr. Robert also, and Dr. The second professor also, their talk was beautiful. Yeah. I would suggest to the Department of Business that they should continue such kind of, international and national. Of course, we are doing our best, but still we need to continue. It should be kind of series, some interaction or some kind of meetings and symposium like this. Thank you very much. I'm very humble and very pleased to listen to all these talks. Although partially, but lastly, I could join you. Thank you very much, Professor.
Share with you something. I have students from during this COVID period. Pakistani PhD student couldn't come. I find one thing: those who are working from Karachi have got very poor internet connection. But if I connect myself to Lahore, where I have taken part a couple of keynote speeches, everybody in any part of the world have no problem. So it looks like the technical problem is very real. But I can tell you even more horror stories like Indonesia. Indonesia, you are rationed because their bandwidth is so backward, but demand is so high. So I used to teach for 14 years, twice a year for 10 days. I have to teach finance to a Monash University program and we will be rationed. While you're just doing some presentation, then arbitrarily the quota system comes in and then you are cut off. Imagine, we physically are there, so we don't use computers. But imagine if it is in another country, probably Zimbabwe like that today, it's possible, So I can understand, like my PhD student.
Yeah, you are right, because we are sitting in the southern part of Punjab province.
Karachi, so
Lahore is that is the capital.
Yeah.
Still, we have very strong a PERN or a interconnectivity system, but sometimes there is some kind of issue in our system.
Yeah,
that's kind of.
So I'm aware of it. There's nothing wrong with that. We just do with what God gives to us. So unfortunately, one day in the future you may have a better bandwidth and better instrument. I found in my life you can buy the most expensive item. $600. And the thing was, one of the items that switches on the whole thing is made in China for $15. The whole system fails. So you are the scientist, every item must work together.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the internet system, but your broadband is bad. You had it.
you are right, Professor Ariff.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll sign off then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I also appreciate efforts of Department of Business, and they did well.
Anytime you come, let me know, Malaysia. We
Thank you very much. And if you have sometime chance to visit Pakistan, we welcome you all the
yeah, I
time.
do come there quite often.
Yeah, please.
See how things improve now that Imran is introducing reform. Travel is getting a little bit better compared to old days.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, much better.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, thank you
I'm
very much.
happy.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank-
Professor. Thank you very much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable time and
Thank
our
you.
distinguished guest. Thank you
Yeah,
very
you
much.
can.
It was-
Yeah, you can learn many things from here, from this talk. I was listening the voice, although I was busy in other matters also. So this is beautiful,
Sure.
and keep continuing such kind of things. They are very important.
Thank you very much, sir.